It's always a pleasure to be back on stage at this wonderful, one-of-a-kind institution.
For you back. Me, it's my first time.
Is this your first time?
First time.
My goodness.
Yeah.
It should not be the last. I first met Stephen, I think 14 years ago in Turkey, when we were both there for several days of thinking through US policy towards Turkey. Stephen is polymathic and one of the few voices I follow very attentively when it comes to this important corner of the world. So we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation because there are a few things on people's
a few things
on people's minds, and I guess I'd just like to begin with kind of just a brief overview of the book, The End of Ambition: America's Past, Present, and Future in the Middle East. You know, for about, at least since Obama ran for office starting in 2007, there has been this persistent wish on a largely bipartisan basis that the United States could, as we did in Southeast Asia 20, 30 years before that, wash our hands of the region, focus on areas that are presumably more important to our core interests, particularly in East Asia. But like that wonderful line from The Godfather, right? Every time I try to get out, they pull me back in. So right now, American policy, much as we'd like to be thinking about China or Ukraine, we're neck deep, even so in the Middle East, a carrier battle group fighting the Houthis in the Red Sea, at least 40,000 American troops in the region, and no end in sight to our involvement. I guess the first question I have is there a Goldilocks type of recipe for being able to remain engaged in the Middle East, to not let its crises and its traumas overspill the boundaries of the region, without at the same time becoming so involved that it becomes kind of the Bermuda Triangle of American policy?
Right. Yes, there is a way to do it, and that's why I wrote the book. But before I get into the answer, first of all, thank you, Bret, for taking the time out of your evening to spend it with me here talking about the book and everything in the Middle East. And thank you all here. It seems like, or at least I heard it was a sellout crowd. So that's pretty awesome. We're like Taylor Swift or Van Halen or something.
Yeah,
it's really great.
We're like Taylor Swift.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Especially with all the things going on in New York tonight.
We're like geriatric Taylor Swift.
Speaking of which, I want to welcome my mom, who's somewhere in the audience here. My sister. I understand, before we get into it, you know there's 613 commandments in the Torah.
Yeah.
There's actually really 614. One of it is, thou shalt go to sleepaway camp. And I understand that there's a big contingent of people from B'nai B'rith Perlman Camp here tonight, so thank you very much for being here. Anyway, now on to the book. Look, the reason why I wrote the book was because there was this drumbeat for years, 10 years at least. We have to get out of the Middle East. We should withdraw from the Middle East. It's not worth it any longer. We should reduce from the Middle East. Where it seemed to me this was a recipe for disaster. There had to be, from my perspective, something that was productive and constructive between the overly ambitious effort to transform the region that actually began in the mid-1990s. Began during the Clinton era. You know, the Cold War was over. We had vanquished Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. And we had a lot of power in the world. And we wanted to transform the world. And one of the places that we really felt we could transform was the Middle East. And Clinton's logic was, through peace, which would be a good thing, we would get reform and change and democratization. George W. Bush turned that logic on its head. We promote reform and change, and we'll get peace in the world. And he did it in a number of ways. The returns on all of those investments were zero. And the reaction...
The return on Oslo was zero. The return on Iraq was zero.
The return on the Freedom Agenda was zero. I mean, look, the Arab uprisings, which came many years after the Freedom Agenda, had nothing to do with the United States. So all of that effort, all of the resources, all of the blood that was spent in transforming the region, the return was, as I said before, less than zero. And the reaction to that in the policy community was, we have to get out. We should withdraw, we should retrench, we don't have core interests in the Middle East any longer. Transition to clean energy is going to save us from having to deal with the Saudis and all these other folks. To me, this seemed like a recipe, as I said before, a recipe for disaster. When we are leaving the region, regional actors tend to take matters into their own hands. Think about what the Saudis did in Yemen, and that was in part because of the United States leaving, or the license we gave to the Iranians to sow chaos throughout the Middle East by saying we're going to leave, or by not responding to the challenges that they presented.
Let me push you, and obviously I'm speaking in a purely cynical way, okay?
Be cynical.
Let's take the Stephen Walt approach to the
That's exactly who I'm thinking of.
So the Saudis bombed the Yemenis. That's their problem. The Iranians hate the Jews. That's their problem. The convulsions of the region, the terrorism between, in Pakistan, its own problem, right? From the kind of the most Kissingerian or Strangelovian perspective of American foreign policy, you can say, well, that's a shame. It would be better if Saudis weren't bombing, the Yemenites, and the Iranians weren't inveigling themselves here and there, or the Jews and the Arabs weren't at war all the time, but it's not a core American interest. So when does it become a core American interest?
I think that it's clearly in the United States, for the United States in the region, there have been three core interests. One is the free flow of energy resources out of the region. That's why Yemen and what's happened in Yemen over the course of the last 10 or 15 years is extremely important. The fact that the Iranians invested so much in the development of Houthi capabilities, which essentially destabilized the Arabian Peninsula, and has now given the Houthis, of all people, and I've broken bread with the Houthis. In a region of really terrible people, they are among the worst of the worst. And it was a pretty good meal, though. The Houthis now have leverage over the Red Sea. 16% of world trade goes through the Red Sea. Think about the knock-on effects of the Houthi ability to now open and close the Red Sea. You have more boats on the ocean spewing more greenhouse gas emissions. Egypt, terribly poor country of 110 million people, rely on Suez Canal tolls for hard currency. 60% of Egyptians' Suez Canal tolls are now down. We don't want Egypt to collapse. That would not only destabilize the Middle East, it would destabilize the entirety of Southern Europe. That's very, very significant. So if we want a region where we can be assured that energy resources can come out safely, that there's stability on the Arabian Peninsula, that Israel is safe, the United States actually does need to be there. The fact that we did not meet the challenges of those previous 10 to 15 years, and let me say, it was a bipartisan effort to avoid meeting these challenges. One of the results of that is what we're seeing today, this multi-front conflict that is going on right now. The United States bent over backwards to avoid having to deal with Iranian mischief throughout the region for a decade or more. And that allowed the Iranians to build up this axis of resistance that is now sowing so much chaos throughout the Middle East. So yes, it's terrible that there's terrorism, the Houthis are fanatics, and so on and so forth. If you look at it just from that perspective, yeah, you can say, oh, there are bigger fish to fry. We can pivot to Asia. But actually, pivoting to Asia is not the right answer to what we confront. If you look at the map, the Middle East is genuinely in the middle between Washington and Beijing. And we both have an interest.
Well, there's also the Pacific, but
okay, yeah. But I'm thinking about the map that hung in my third grade classroom, okay, where you go one to the other. Now I look one. This is
how he became a Middle Eastern scholar.
Right.
Just kind of goofing off in third grade.
Exactly. That looks like a kind of cool place. It's actually not that far off, to be completely honest with you. So This is a place that in our global competition with the Chinese, our kind of global competition
I just want to push you on one point before you get there.
Okay.
Why is it a core American interest that Israel be secure?
Yeah, and this is the selling part of it. I go through that in some detail in the third chapter of the book, but
I think you know that I think it's a core American interest. I'm asking this
Bret Stephens
out of a, you know.
This is something that, it's a great question because people often want to reduce the U.S.-Israel relationship to one thing. It's about security. It's about politics. It's actually, if you look at the history of the U.S.-Israel relationship, it's bound up in history, theology, security, politics, historical memory. All of those things all wrapped up together in which, you know, the United States, Americans, it's been non-controversial up until pretty recently for the United States to want to help ensure Israeli security for all of those things. A totally non-controversial thing. Americans have been willing to invest in it, this issue, defend for this issue, and sacrifice for this issue. Those three things really are the tell that this is a core interest of the United States. It strikes me that, getting back to the previous question, that if we're not willing to defend those core interests, we're going to allow our global and regional adversaries to undermine everything that we've worked for over the course of the last 50 or so years in the Middle East.
So one way I think about this, and push back if you'd like, is there are two ways of conducting policy in many areas. One is making dreams come true, and the other is keeping nightmares at bay. Our attempt to make dreams come true in the Middle East, peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, failed. Bringing 21st century democracy to Afghanistan failed. Reforming Iraqi institutions so it would become an outpost of moderation in the Middle East, that failed. All those policies that were kind of dreamlike ambitions to reshape this region in an image that was much more akin to the West than it has been, all those came to grief. But I can think of a number of nightmares that we'd like to keep at bay. We don't want Israel to be destroyed. We don't want the collapse of Middle Eastern states like Egypt to lead to migration crises of the kind that we saw in 2015, which transformed Western politics. In fact, I've sometimes thought, if you want to understand how Trump got elected in 2016, look at what happened in Europe in 2015.
Exactly.
There was a cascade effect. And we don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. And if you agree with that sort of broad typology, I'd like to kind of go through this, starting with the question of Iran. Because as we're speaking tonight, this question hangs over, you know, this entire room, not to mention the world stage, which is, how do you imagine things unfolding in the next 24 hours, 24 days, or whatever, in Israel's immediate confrontation with Iran? And then the question of Iranian nuclearization, which very smart people, you know, I think of Roel Gerecht and Ray Takei, they say it's inevitable. They're getting a bomb. So walk us through this particular nightmare.
Yeah. What you started out with is important, and it's a central theme of the book, which is there are no unicorns and rainbows in U.S. foreign policy. And we should not chase unicorns and rainbows in U.S. foreign policy. I put it somewhat differently in the book. The argument is, when we've tried to leverage American power to make good things happen, we tend to fail. When we try to use American power to prevent bad things from happening, we're usually pretty good at it. And there was a period of American success where we genuinely prevented the nightmare scenarios. And we got away from that post-1991, when we were chasing unicorns and rainbows throughout the Middle East. And as I pointed out, and you well know, we failed at those things. So now, what do? We're confronted with this environment. What is it that we need to prevent? And I think that by and large, what the administration has done, for the most part throughout this conflict, is perfectly consistent with preventing bad things from happening. People have gotten exercised about some of the rhetoric that the president or the vice president and others have used with regard to the conflict. But the fact of the matter is that the United States has provided the longest running, most extensive air bridge to the IDF in history, along with the resupply by naval vessels as well. And so what it has done is helped to prevent threats to Israeli security. And we just had news reports that the United States was going to deploy this anti-missile system to help defend Israel against Iran's ballistic missiles.
Just out of curiosity, is that deployment happening to help defend Israel or to help stay Israel's hand?
Okay, so it can be both. Yeah. It can be both. One, it does help to defend Israel, and it's part of a negotiation between the two countries. It's a way of incentivizing the Israelis not to hit certain targets that the Israelis might otherwise be interested in hitting, and they're likely relatively soon, sometime in the next 24 to 24 days response to what the Iranians did almost 2 weeks ago, which was to fire 200 ballistic missiles at Israel and cross a number of Israeli red lines. I think, with this deployment, there's been a lot of chatter in the press. Informed sources, people familiar with discussions, would suggest that the Israelis have taken the nuclear program off the table, have taken Iran's energy infrastructure off the table. I wouldn't bet on it. The list of Iranian targets is actually very, very long, and the Israelis clearly understand what is a direct threat to them, ballistic missiles, ballistic missile launchers, and what's incredibly important and symbolic to the regime, IRGC headquarters and the nuclear program. Now, this isn't to suggest that the Israelis can wipe out the Iranian nuclear program, but they can try to set it back. I'm with Ruel Garect and my colleague Ray Turkey. I think it's inevitable that the Iranians become nuclear capable. I say in the book, let's just assume that they are, given how close they have become, that they are going to be a nuclear capable state. But you can set it back. You can detain and deter. And I think one of the things that the Israelis are going to try to do here is climb way up the escalation ladder to try to intimidate the Iranians and make them think twice about responding. There's a tremendous amount of risk in that.
And so what would that, Tachlis, what does that mean?
I think what that means is instead of just demonstrating the ability to penetrate Iranian airspace and hit targets at will, they will act like they did in April. They said, this is what they did in April. They fired on Iran. They said, you were unable to hit us, but we can penetrate your airspace at will. We will send a message this time. Now, in response to the 200 ballistic missiles, they will actually hit meaningful targets. Like I said, ballistic missiles, ballistic missile fabrication plants, IRGC, regime-sensitive, politically important sites like IRGC headquarters. And I would discount, apologies, what journalists are now saying that they've heard from sources familiar with the discussions about the nuclear program. This is, and I think this is one of the things that people, I think, misapprehend about this current conflict and Israeli thinking about it, is that this is genuinely an existential conflict from their perspective. And so that's why I think all of the, for many months, this talk about a ceasefire and this kind of brain cramp about how are we going to get a ceasefire, when there was never really a ceasefire to begin with. Neither Hamas wanted the ceasefire, nor were the Israelis willing to lay down their arms until they achieved their battlefield objectives, which they were convinced and remain convinced that they can achieve. With Iran now demonstrating that it can hit Israel, and it did some damage to Israel, the Israelis are going to have to demonstrate to the Iranians that it is extremely, extremely painful to hit Israel.
I want to circle back actually to the broader war that Israel finds itself in, but first, let's go a little further on the question of Israeli targeting, because I think this is sort of interesting beyond a merely tactical perspective. If I were the Israeli prime minister, my thinking would be that his strategy is kick the can down the road until the Iranian regime collapses, and we've seen evidence of its profound internal weaknesses and its unpopularity. And so what kind of Israeli strike would do more to accelerate regime weakness, collapse, and what kind of strike would actually give the Iranian regime, what Bernard Lewis used to say was the gift of Iranian patriotism, which is rally Iranians to the regime. And so my sense, if I had to place a small bet, was that the Israelis will go after IRGC headquarters. They will punch a hole in the wall of Evin prison, where the Iranians keep many of their political prisoners. They will go after they'll bomb the mausoleum of the Ayatollah Khomeini. They will do everything they can to underline the unpopularity of the regime. What they want to do is get a song in the heart of ordinary Iranians. On the other hand, if they destroy the oil infrastructure and immediately immiserate not just the regime, but the entire country, which depends for 70% or so of its revenue on oil, then it will have the opposite effect. Is that a reasonable surmise?
I think it's hard. I think you make a very, very good point, except I think it's hard to engage in regime change by missile.
Yeah.
Or F-35 fighter. I do think, though, it is certainly within the Israeli thinking to, one, what threatens us the most, and that's the ballistic missiles. Two, what can we make a political point? And that's where IRGC headquarters. I mean, Iranians hate the IRGC. They hate the regime.
Or the Basij.
Or the Basij. Any of those kind of regime-sensitive type sites, I think, are something that the Israelis seriously consider doing. They, for their own concern about their security, I would not take off the table the idea that they might go after at least parts of the Iranian nuclear program. I don't think that has the same kind of patriotic effect on it, given how many resources have been diverted to produce this elaborate nuclear program that has been going on for 40 years. And that is a symbol of this kind of the regime and a terrible regime at the same time. So I think all of those things are incredibly important, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it having one effect or the other. I think the Iranian regime, the Iran analysts that I know and love the best say, like Brezhnev's Russia, it could be 3 weeks or it could be 30 years. And I think the idea of using airstrikes to hasten this is maybe a little too optimistic about the effect of airstrikes.
Let's step back about 900 miles to Gaza and Lebanon. One question I think many of us have is whether the Israelis are biting off more than they can chew, and whether there is any, despite the tactical brilliance of Israel's first steps against Hezbollah with the pagers and, of course, the strike on Nasrallah, that beyond that, what's the thinking? Similarly with Gaza, do you think the Israelis have something like an endgame in mind, or this just keeps going until hopefully Sinwar dies or something like that?
Yes and no. First of all, I was in Israel for the pager and walkie-talkie attacks. I was actually collecting my phone from the locker that you have to keep it in after you see the U.S. ambassador and turned it on. And it was like blowing up, not literally, but blowing up with the blowing up kind of thing. It was a rather extraordinary.
But are you sure the Israelis? Because I was told that actually Belgian intelligence was behind.
That's right. It was a Taiwanese, Hungarian, Belgian. Yes. Look, I think that the Israelis do. We've given sort of short shrift, and we haven't listened closely to the Israelis. Part of that is the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu, to say the least, has a trust deficit with a lot of people. But I think this is an existential conflict, and I think that if you listen very carefully to what the Israelis say, they do have an end game in mind. Whether they can achieve that is a different story. So the end game in Gaza is the following. And the Prime Minister's closest advisor has articulated this, which is overall...
This is Ron?
Ron Dermer. Overall Israeli security control over the Gaza Strip, which is about as close to the status quo ante as you're going to get. No two-state solution, no revitalized Palestinian Authority, no Emiratis and Saudis coming in to the rescue with oodles of rials to rebuild Gaza, but rather the Israelis ringing the Gaza Strip with security forces, remaining in the Netzarim corridor, which is this east-west access road,
basically
splitting bisecting the Gaza Strip in two, and giving them the ability to do what they've done in the West Bank, which is to conduct counterterrorism operations. That is what it basically is. Now, there are others in Israel who have other ideas about this. The hard-right settler community would like to resettle the Gaza Strip, and that's going to be a very significant challenge to the government. They're both part of the government and opposed to the government. But what happens?
That's like my family deciding to move back to Kishinev from whence we came
Let me
after
tell you
the
something.
pogrom.
You know, I spent time with these folks, and this is, and they're going, I can see them challenging the IDF, dropping a double wide in the middle of what was a settlement and daring the IDF not to defend it. So, but anyway, but the government at least has this goal of overall security control where they have freedom of action in the Gaza Strip.
And that doesn't consign Israel to fighting an endless guerrilla war.
It does.
Of the kind that...
It does, but what it prevents Hamas from being able to pose that existential threat to Israel. Look, in recent days, there's been press reports that Hamas was planning actually something bigger than October 7th. If you look at their statement announcing...
You mean Hezbollah was planning something?
Both of them.
Yeah.
Both of them. That if you look at the statement announcing Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, it was deeply genocidal. It was about the destruction of Israel. It wasn't about the liberation of Gaza and the West Bank. It was about the liberation of Palestine. And so the Israelis are going to have to spend more on defense, but this is what they're setting themselves up to do, is to conduct nonstop counterterrorism operations. Otherwise, they lose control of a chunk of their own territory.
And let's say they do this for 2 years, okay? And they really wipe out, you know, they get Sinwar, they take out levels and levels of Hamas fighters. You have, you know, a situation in Gaza sort of similar to what you have now in some West Bank towns, Jenin, for instance. Then what? You just stay there unto eternity, or?
The most dynamic end of the Israeli political spectrum right now is the right.
Yeah.
And they have a more potent argument than they had in 2005 when the Israelis withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Because everything that they said was going to happen, happened. And so their argument, and it's one that I think resonates well beyond the settler community, that Israel has to be there in some way, shape, or form in order to secure the state. Because...
And do you think it is a non-starter to convince Saudis and Emiratis and Egyptians, some coalition of states that are effectively at peace with Israel, if not formally at peace, to invest in a Gazan, like what I've thought of as an Arab mandate for Gaza, a 20-year commitment to turn Gaza into something that more resembles one of the Emirati cities, and make this an Arab opportunity, because the Arab states also suffer from a Gaza that is sort of an endless gaping wound, not only for Gazans themselves, but also for Arab pride.
It sounds great. First of all, the Saudi history of promising support and rebuilding is much longer than them actually delivering.
No, I thought the Norwegians would pay for it.
The other problem is
that
that's not necessarily what people want. They don't want Dubai on the Mediterranean. They want Palestine.
Yeah.
They want Palestine. So the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Qataris, everybody can get together and say, look at what we're going to build. And that's not where people are. The idea for many Palestinians, and there are Palestinians obviously who want peace and so on and so forth, but that they want a sense of justice, and building a Dubai on the Mediterranean isn't the sense of justice that they're seeking.
Well, I mean, the Germans also wanted a sense of justice, and then Dresden, and they settled for, you know, better cars and excellent coffee machines.
And there is an argument out there that says you have to totally defeat the Palestinians to get them there. But what more defeat can you apply to the Palestinians? There's something very important about Palestinian identity under occupation, and that is there's two I think critical factors. One is steadfastness. It's called sumud in Arabic. And the other is actually resistance, not necessarily armed resistance, but resistance to the injustices that have been meted out to the Palestinian population. It's very difficult and challenging ideas, but that doesn't necessarily translate into we give up. And we'll take what the Saudis and the Emiratis have to give us.
Turn now 100 miles north, not even 100 miles north, to the sort of longer-term strategy for Israel in all of Lebanon.
Yeah, it's like the Israelis are going back to their policies of the early 2000s and deciding, you know what, it didn't really work. And they're going back to policies of the 80s and 1990s.
Like a security zone in southern Lebanon?
Well, right. I mean, this is the problem that the Israelis confront right now. They can clear out that area between the Israeli border and the Litani River, which is a river that runs parallel to the border 18 miles north of it, which is what the demand has been. At the end of the 2006 conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, there was a UN Security Council resolution 1701, and it said no forces can be south of the Litani River other than UN peacekeepers and the Lebanese army. Well, we'll see how that worked out. So what the Israelis are trying to do is implement UN Security Council resolution 1701.
So it's an irony of irony that it's the Israelis who are finally implementing it.
UN resolution. And so the problem is they don't want to stay, but who are they going to give it to? UNIFIL, the UN peacekeepers, and the Lebanese army, who allowed Hezbollah to come back and build tunnels and command centers and hundreds of thousands of rockets right on the Israeli border. So the problem is, who are the Israelis going to get handed off to? There's no longer a southern Lebanese army, which were these Christian militias that helped them out between 1985 and the Israeli withdrawal in May 2000. All those guys own restaurants in Haifa now.
I know.
They're good, right. Good. Some of the best food. Yeah. So the problem is they have an understanding of what they want to do and where they want to go and can do it. Although, look, after the beepers and the walkie-talkie and taking out Hassan Nasrallah, taking out his successor and doing all of this damage, Hezbollah is still bringing it. I've counted about 2,000 rocket attacks on Israel since Nasrallah was killed. That's the Israelis really had a spring in their step after killing Nasrallah. The songs that they made up were actually kind of hilarious, but now reality is sinking
profane
in.
Otherwise
profane. Yes, I'm not going to repeat them.
Here.
You can find them easily on the Twitters or YouTube. So they're now finding out that their deterrence didn't work, and now they're in for a long fight.
Which means what?
Which means my concern is that the Israelis are going to get stuck in southern Lebanon again because they have no one to hand it off to. No one to hand it off to. Who in their right mind, who's raising their hands? Is there going to be a NATO force there that wants to get shot at by the remnants of Hezbollah or the PFLP or whomever? It's an impossible situation. And that's why, the Israelis are confronted with a security dilemma no matter what they do. So it's really a decision for them what's the least worst option. And that's generally what foreign policy and security policy is about, which is the least worst option. They were attacked by Hamas on October 7th, and they were attacked by Hezbollah on October 8th. They clearly cannot allow the northern part of the country to be emptied of people. That would provide Hezbollah, a weakened Hezbollah and Iran, a strategic victory. To open the question of Israeli sovereignty to make it impossible for Israelis to live within sovereign Israel is something that the Israelis cannot abide with.
Is there a way this ends without one side or the other inflicting a knockout blow? Does it escalate, or do you think it's possible to press pause?
There has been some diplomacy around this. Gulf foreign ministers met with the Iranian foreign minister. That's meaningful, but until the supreme leader says something and does something, it's it's not going to happen. And I think that there's a lot of fight left in both sides here. So I think it's going to go on for some time. Look, the United States, not really France, but the French want to be along with us, tried for many months to hammer out some sort of diplomatic agreement.
The French are proving their diplomatic bona fides once again by trying to impose an arms embargo on Israel, despite the fact that they sell no arms to Israel. It's a
minor detail.
A masterpiece of French diplomacy.
And the French like to pretend that they still have influence in Lebanon. I have news for them. The Iranians have influence in Lebanon. The French definitely do not have influence in Lebanon. So there has been this effort, and the Israelis were actually quite patient. 6 months they waited for there to be a diplomatic agreement. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, said over and over again, we are willing to sign on to a diplomatic agreement, but it has to be more than a piece of paper. It cannot be UN Resolution 1701 all over again. It has to include Hezbollah actually pulling back from the border, which Hezbollah was never going to do. I mean, I've been known to listen to, read Hassan Nasrallah before he died, or the news outlet of Hezbollah called Al-Manar.
Yes,
and they've said
terrific.
It's terrific stuff, great stuff. So, you know,
it's like Fox News minus. Lord
I was going to say the New York Times. In any event. All right, just a little.
I wasn't going to make that joke.
Al-Manar, when all of these reports of American diplomacy and that there was a working paper available that it was going to be the basis of a Hezbollah withdrawal to the northern bank of the Litani River, Al-Manar said that this was a fantasy of the United States and the French, that it was never going to happen. And it didn't happen. And so now the Israelis were once again good to their word. And I think that there's a problem in the way in which we have thought about this conflict, we being the royal we, not the two of us, which is that we have discounted some of the things that the Israelis have said that they were going to do, and each and every time they say they were going to do something, they absolutely 100% said they were going to do it. And they went ahead and did it.
Yeah.
Rafah, they went ahead and did it. Lebanon now, they went ahead and did it. That's why I would not discount the fact that despite whatever agreement the president thinks he has with Prime Minister Netanyahu about energy infrastructure or nuclear infrastructure in Iran, I would not be surprised if we woke up one morning and the Israelis had hit the nuclear infrastructure or the energy infrastructure, as well as a variety of other things.
I'm about to ask a few of the audience questions, but before that, I just wanted to offer you one more thought about why it's in America's strategic interest to defend Israel, which goes beyond parochial questions of American politics. We are now faced, as we were in the 1930s, with an alliance of aggressive, as they say in the foreign policy community, revisionist states who want to revise the global order. They are increasingly entwined in their outlook and their ambitions. And they confront us on a whole number of fronts: in Ukraine, in the Straits of Taiwan, and not least in Israel. And when the battle lines are drawn that way, it's in the interest of the United States to defend all of its allies at the frontier of the conflict so that it doesn't come back to haunt us in the homeland. And I think in that sense, there's a persuasive case to make about the importance to the United States to defend a global order that's under threat on many fronts, but maybe most vividly, whether it's in the Litani or in Gaza.
Let me add, I think that that's a more relevant point to Ukraine than Israel, by and large. Again, like I mentioned before, I think that the administration has overseen this extraordinary resupply effort of the IDF, although the administration has also been vulnerable to the politics of all of this, which is changing. I think that it's largely right, though, that there is this axis: the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the Iranians, and that this conflict has actually compelled those four to actually work even closer together than they had before. I wonder, though, how many Americans, as we're in this election season, I don't mean to start into a political conversation, but how many Americans actually agree with this idea? After all, I mean, one of the things that I get at the heart of this book is that Americans elected 3 presidents in a row who said, it's not worth it. Our core interests aren't actually engaged in these places. And that goes for Ukraine as well. And I don't see in the Middle East a huge difference between a Harris administration and a Trump administration other than in style. And
Really?
That's important. Yeah, no, I don't. I don't see a huge difference between the two of them. I think the former president has been bellicose about the Middle East, but never good to his word when it comes to his bellicosity. I think he's been, at those moments when it came up that it was important to confront the Iranians, he whiffed. He said, I'm not going to do it. And there was bipartisan consensus not to do it.
Qasem Soleimani?
Qasem Soleimani was one thing, but he threw out the Carter Doctrine and the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine, which maintained security and stability in the Persian Gulf for 40 years.
I have a question. How confident are you that Donald Trump had ever heard or understood the content of the Carter Doctrine or the Reagan corollary to the Carter Doctrine?
I mean, I'm 100% confident he had no idea what either of those things were. But when, after the Iranians bombed 2 major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia in September 2019, and he said, they didn't bomb us, they bombed Saudi Arabia, I'm waiting for a call from Riyadh, the effect was the same, whether he knew it or not. And that gave the Iranians permission to sow chaos in other places as well.
And your view of a Harris, this is, by the way, the first question that I had, so.
I had no idea.
Don't take it as if I'm not asking questions, but, and a Harris administration conducts itself in roughly the same way?
Again, this has been a bipartisan affair. The Democratic foreign policy community, I don't want to use establishment, has a pejorative term to it, and I guess I'm part of the American foreign policy establishment just by dint of where I work, have convinced themselves, against all evidence, that the Iranians want a new and better relationship with the United States. And the Biden-Harris administration spent the first 2.5 years in office chasing the Iranians around the Persian Gulf, saying, hey, let's have another agreement, let's have another agreement. The Iranians weren't biting. The Iranians are willing to have these kind of interim agreements on certain issues while retaining for themselves the right to sow chaos in other realms. And I think that's entirely clear. They do not want a new relationship with the United States. They want to push they have 2 foreign policy goals in the Middle East: to push the United States out and to destroy Israel, and 3, to advance their interests, their kind of what's left of their revolutionary spirit throughout the region.
Okay, to the questions. What's the story with Rob Malley?
I got this question the other day.
Well,
do you know who?
Great minds must think alike.
You and whoever asked that question, and some dude in Santa Fe. Rob Malley was the coordinator for negotiations with the Iranians under the Biden administration. He also served in the Obama administration, a well-known figure in Washington. Over a year ago, his security clearances were pulled, and he
was our point man.
Point man on negotiations with the Iranians.
And he was notorious for being sympathetic, or at least, I don't know, what's the word, flexible?
He was genuinely interested in reviving, or bringing the United States and Iran back into the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement. That was his role. He was interested in doing it. He was a supporter of the agreement, and he felt that this was the most important foreign policy issue for the United States at the beginning of the administration. And he was empowered to bring these negotiations to a successful conclusion. A year or a little more ago, his security clearances were pulled, and he was placed on administrative leave from the Department of State. And there's been really no information about the status of the investigation into him. Everybody I know with a security clearance, and if you live in Washington, you really can't swing a dead cat without hitting someone with the highest security clearances, say that this is a strange situation. That the length of this investigation and how he's in limbo and how this all happened was quite strange. What I will say is the same thing I said in Santa Fe. He's presumed innocent. There is an investigation that's underway by the Department of Justice, and we'll just have to see how it plays out. But it is definitely a strange situation. There are plenty of stories of people mishandling classified information. It gets cleared up, and their clearances are reinstated. This and Congress hasn't been able to get any answers about what's happened and what he actually did. So it makes it a more sensational story, but mostly for inside the Beltway types like myself.
Would it be desirable for the United States to go back to a JCPOA-like agreement?
Well, I think I was not one of these Washington analysts who got myself all spun up about the JCPOA. It was an arms control agreement, and arms control agreements are, by their nature, flawed. And once there is an arms control agreement, the party that really wants it is willing to overlook violations of the other party, and that's precisely what happened. What was this was my problem with the JCPOA. At the heart of it was an assumption that by the time the restrictions on the Iran nuclear program went away, there would be a new regime, or there would be a new relationship between the United States and Iran, when that was not what the Iranians wanted at all. They were willing to, because they have a much longer timeline than any of us or any US policymaker, they were willing to accept sanctions relief and the billions of dollars that went with it, pause or slow down their nuclear work, and then in 10 or 15 years go back to doing it. It really wasn't an ironclad agreement. Do I think that Trump leaving the JCPOA was a good idea? No, because it has knock-on effects, that if we want to have agreements in the future, it makes it much harder to have those agreements. But in fact, the sky didn't fall. The conventional wisdom is that when President Trump pulled the United States out of the Iran nuclear agreement, that is when the Iranians began their work on the nuclear program in earnest. In fact, much of the progress that the Iranians have made in recent years began in January 2021. That's not a political statement. That is an objective fact, that they have enriched more uranium to certain levels more since President Biden took office than during President Trump's time in office.
Because of the maximum pressure campaign under Trump, or
It's possible it was a result of the maximum pressure campaign. We do know, though, that since President Biden and his administration, in the form of Rob Malley, sought to re-enter the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear work sped up.
Let's talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia. Do you think there's still...
One of my favorite subjects.
One of your favorite subjects. Your favorite subjects involve rock bands from the 80s.
Okay, you're diming me out here.
But other than David Lee Roth's role in the Jewish people's destiny.
I once had a poster. Of David Lee Roth wearing a tallis.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I know. I don't know why he isn't in the Hanukkah song.
Yeah, I know.
But let's go back to Saudi Arabia.
Okay, sorry, Saudi Arabia.
Is a deal still in the cards? A Saudi-U.S.-Israel deal?
Unlikely to happen for the next 3 weeks, but I do think that the parties remain...
Just as a kind of an FU to the Biden administration from the Saudis?
No, I don't. I actually don't think. I don't think it is. I think the Saudis are interested in it. They believe that the only way to get this deal was while Biden was in the White House and while the Democrats controlled the Senate.
Right.
So they were working hard at it. My understanding is that their constant rewriting of the agreement between the United States. So let me just explain for a second. The United States wanted to sign a security pact with Saudi Arabia. This is a way for the United States to outmaneuver the Chinese and the Russians in the region. And the security pact was not just, we will come to defend you. There was a whole host of things. We were going to provide them with civilian nuclear technology. They had to agree to ratchet back their cooperation with the Chinese on AI and a whole variety of other things. It was a kind of multifaceted diplomatic agreement, the heart of which was a security pact. The administration decided, though, because Saudi Arabia is so unpopular in the Senate, particularly with the Democratic caucus, that the only way to actually get this security pact was to wrap it around a Saudi-Israel normalization deal. That this was going to be the sugar that was going to help make the Saudi-U.S. security pact go down.
Because the Democrats are so fond of it.
Well, this was prior to October 7th. Then we have October 7th, and they're continuing to negotiate this and continuing to negotiate this security pact. And the United States is constantly, I was in Saudi Arabia in late April, and they were expecting to have an agreed, done deal within a couple of weeks. But the administration kept rewriting and rewriting the agreement, and the price of the Saudi normalization with Israel was going up. Prior to October 7th, or prior to January 2024, the Saudis would say, yeah, some problems need to be resolved, but they weren't necessarily articulating that there needed to be a two-state solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in order for them to normalize relations. Well, it turns out that the Biden administration sort of encouraged the Saudis to raise the price of normalization as a way to leverage the Israelis and their military conduct in the Gaza Strip. Needless to say, that did not work. So now we're stuck at this moment where the Saudis are demanding a price for normalization that they would not have otherwise demanded, and the Saudi-U.S. security pact is never going to pass a democratically controlled Senate. I had said you need to really separate these two things. If a Saudi-U.S. security pact is so important to the United States, the president should take it to his former colleagues and make the case for it. But to wrap it around the Israel thing was making things far more complicated than they needed to be. Look, the Saudis want to normalize relations with the Israelis. They believe it is an important goal. Part of their overall development plan, which is called Vision 2030, which is odd because you have 2020 vision, it's weird. Anyway, Vision 2030, it requires the integration of the region, and a centerpiece of that is Saudi-Israel normalization. This is
if the Israelis find themselves in a kind of endless war on at least two fronts, if not more, does that diminish the chances of, I mean, why would Saudi Arabia want to take the risks of making peace with the Israelis if Israel is seen as a domestic political liability? I mean, I can understand why the Saudis were interested when Israel seemed like it was kind of a strong horse in the region before October 7th. Now that case seems to me a little bit weaker from their point of view.
It's definitely a little weaker on the security front. Yeah. But if you look at the Saudi-Emirati relationship, there's a significant security component of it. But you have more trade in the last year between Israel and the Emirates than you did prior to the war in Gaza. The only way I could get to Israel was on Emirates airline. I flew to Dubai. I flew another 3 hours, and then I flew an airline called Fly Dubai to Tel Aviv.
You sound like Eric Adams. Like the only way I could get flying
nice.
a business class seat on Emirates.
Well played. Although I wasn't doing anything, I have nothing to do with building codes. And then I flew Fly Dubai, which has like 10 packed flights a day between Tel Aviv and Dubai. So for the Saudis, there is certainly a security component to it. But if they have a security pact with the United States, it makes the Israelis sort of superfluous. You know, there'll be a regional, what we call regional security architecture. But the United States is the big dog. What the Saudis want to do is they want to develop economically, technologically, all these things. And they see the Israelis as a real engine of technology and development. Do the Saudis question? No. I mean, look. The Saudis say the Middle East would be a lot better off without Hamas and Hezbollah. They're just surprised that it's taken the Israelis so long to take care of this problem. They're essentially on the same side as the Israelis. The problem is that the Saudi population, most of whom are 18 to 50 years old, are seeing the images from Gaza in particular, and it's turning them, they were never wildly supportive of normalization, but they were willing to accept the idea of normalization, and now the Saudis fear that this, for the first time in a generation, is a live issue.
A couple more questions. Would Israel's strategic position be better, worse, or the same under a different prime minister?
You took my line. You know, I want to say yes, but I also want to explain, which is, I guess, the reason why you asked the question. There's something, you all know what BDS is, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There's something I call the other BDS, BB derangement syndrome. And this lays all the problems at the feet of the prime minister. And clearly there is a trust deficit between this prime minister and virtually everybody. He was declared persona non grata by James Baker when James Baker was the Secretary of State. Bill Clinton, upon meeting Prime Minister Netanyahu after the prime minister was first elected in the summer of 1996, said, quote, "Now this is the president of the United States, not me. Mom, this is the president, not me." Who's the fucking superpower here? That was Bill Clinton. Clearly, Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama couldn't stand to be in the same room with each other. I read Jared Kushner's memoir, so none of you had to. And perhaps the one thing I did learn in that book was that President Trump didn't like Netanyahu. He was rooting for Benny Gantz to win those series of elections while he was in office. And obviously, President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu have had problems with each other. But on the kind of like really important issues of the day,
those are just the Americans.
Right.
Talk to the Israelis.
Right. And when I got to Israel, 3 weeks ago, I got right off the plane, showered, and went to a huge anti-Netanyahu protest in Israel. But I will say on the critical issues, two-state solution, revitalization of a Palestinian state, this kind of day-after plan that includes Saudis and Emiratis and so on and so forth, Netanyahu is right in there with the mainstream of Israelis, 2/3 of whom oppose these ideas, at least at the moment they do. I think the real fight is not about foreign policy, it's about domestic politics. It's about that judicial reform that we were hearing so much about prior to October 7th, and the fact that so much energy was taken up by this judicial reform and so on and so forth that it left a relatively cohesive Israeli society at each other's throats, and thus they weren't prepared for the challenge, the post-October 7th challenges. I'll point out that someone like Benny Gantz, who is the leader of the Blue and White Party, and people think of him as some great hope, the vice president and the national security advisor of the United States met him. He came here, I think it was in December. Yeah. And the readout basically was they were really surprised that he and Netanyahu were shoulder to shoulder on the core issues of the day. And in fact, Gantz who is considered a centrist, ran to the right of Netanyahu on Gaza. And when he was in the war cabinet, said, why should we provide humanitarian aid to the Gaza Strip? I do think, though, that there is something about Netanyahu, his trust deficit, that overall undermines Israel's narrative in the world. There's probably more of a consensus around right now in Israel about someone like Naftali Bennett, who is solidly, right of center. All those kind of that mushy middle of liberal Zionists that can be anywhere from left of center, center to right of center. Now they're more right of center. They can coalesce around someone like Naftali Bennett, who's not interested in a two-state solution, but so within the mainstream, but seen as a more responsible leader. A dear old friend of mine said to me, a guy in his mid-50s, professional, said to me that for the first time in his life, when the Israeli prime minister makes a decision, he's unsure whether it's in the best interest of the country or in the best interests of the prime minister. So I think not only for Israel's strategic position, but also for Israeli politics, maybe a different prime minister would be beneficial. Of course, now he enjoys 68-seat majority in the Knesset. So this government, ironically, the government that was in place for October 7th, the greatest security failure in the state's history, at least since October 1973, will, unlike the last 20 years, probably serve out its entire 4-year term, which ends in 2026, and there'll be an election, and who knows where we'll be by then. But right now, if there was an election, I'd say the chances are pretty good that the Israeli prime minister would be named Netanyahu again.
So in the last 2 minutes of our conversation...
That's it? I'm just getting warmed up.
All right, Fidel.
Nice.
In the last 2 minutes of the conversation, just 2 questions. In 50 years, will there still be an Israel? And will American policy wonks like us, the next generation, still be worried about American policy in the Middle East?
Yes, there will definitely be in Israel. I mean,
Because?
this is a thriving, resilient society that is well integrated in the global economy. I was 23 years old the first time I went to Israel and lived there for a year. The country's almost unrecognizable. I'm a lot older than I look, but it's been kind of a long time, but it is totally unrecognizable, fully integrated into the world. I think one of the problems that Israelis are having now is that, they were enjoying bourgeois Israel, and now they have to go back to like what their grandparents did. But it is firmly rooted. It is not going to go away. I'm fully convinced of that. And there's a lot in the book about just how successful Israel has been. Will my grandchildren, God willing, have grandchildren, and if they decide that they want to follow in the footsteps of their grandfather and be a Middle East policy wonker? God, I hope they don't. Will they be worried about U.S. policy in the Middle East? Absolutely. Absolutely. Like you said, it just pulls us back in. I think that there's one of the interesting things about the Middle East right now is that you have this terrible, terrible conflict that's going on. Lots of bloodshed, lots of suffering, and there's this other track. The Saudis, the Emiratis, the Israelis getting together. There is this extraordinary flow of ideas and business and people going on between India and the Gulf and the Levant in the form of Israel and so on and so forth. And that's all really good, but I don't see how these security dilemmas are resolved in my lifetime. So I do think the next generation are going to be worried about U.S. policy in the region.
All right, so we're in Al Pacino land. It's a wonderful book, The End of Ambition. Read it. Get Stephen's signature. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bret.